The NCAA has complied immediately, by the way. That's good. But I understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well,
Not here.
are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
That confrontation between Trump and Maine's Governor Janet Mills took place on February 21st, and he threatened to cut off her state's funding if she refused to comply with his discriminatory anti-trans sports ban in schools. But as you saw, she did not back down, which is encouraging because so many other Democrats are rolling over and showing Trump their bellies. For example, Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer stood alongside him at a rally and gave a speech, while California's Governor Gavin Newsome is getting buddy-buddy with Trump-aligned white supremacists like Charlie Kirk and Steve Bannon. Not great people. Not to mention other Democrats like Alyssa Slotkin are pretending to know how to fight Trumpism, even though she voted to confirm 9 of Donald Trump's nominees. Which is why most Democratic Party voters don't think that elected Democrats are doing enough to push back against Donald Trump. And it's because they aren't. We're talking about a legitimate threat to our entire system of governance. People are getting kidnapped and punished without due process. They're arresting judges and threatening to arrest sitting members of Congress as well as governors. If your instinct is to collaborate with this fascist administration for self-serving reasons because you think it's going to make you look more reasonable when you inevitably run for president in 2028, you should change your registration from Democrat to Republican. But as you saw, Janet Mills was one of the few Democrats who didn't stand down to Donald Trump's authoritarian impulses and threats. And after that testy exchange from February, Trump actually opened a probe into her state because she didn't back down. Specifically, they investigated her trans-inclusive policies. The Department of Education did this. And about a month later, Trump demanded a full-throated apology from her, as well as a commitment from her to not disobey the federal government ever again in order to avoid consequences for her recalcitrance. But she never budged, not a single time. And Trump was basically threatening to deny federal funding for school lunches to all of Maine's children if she didn't agree to discriminate against trans athletes. And just in case you were curious as to how many trans athletes are in the state of Maine altogether, local publications estimate that out of tens of thousands of high school athletes, there are just about 2 known trans athletes in the entire state of Maine. So the Trump administration thought that it was justified to potentially let more than 170,000 students potentially go hungry just to make sure those 2 trans students are discriminated against. It is a laughably stupid proposition, and Governor Mills refused to cave, rightfully so. And I'm glad that she stood her ground because guess what happened? Trump didn't. This was a game of chicken, and Trump backed down first, which means Janet Mills won. The Advocate reports the Trump administration has backed down after a federal court intervened in its attempt to cut off funding for Maine's school meal programs, punishment for the state's refusal to discriminate against transgender people by barring trans girls from participating in girls' sports. Under a legal settlement announced Friday, the U.S. Department of Agriculture agreed to restore access to millions of dollars in nutrition funding and to stop using school meals as a weapon in President Donald Trump's anti-trans agenda, at least for now. The victory for Maine is also a win for basic decency and due process. Trump's USDA had frozen more than $3 million in funding for programs that feed over 170,000 children and vulnerable adults in the state, claiming Maine's inclusive sports policy violated Title IX. But a federal judge ruled last month that the agency had likely failed to follow required legal procedures. Rather than risk a broader injunction, the USDA folded. And that, my friends, is how it's done. Take note, Gretchen Whitmer and Gavin Newsome and Alyssa Slotkin, you actually don't have to cuck yourself to Donald Trump, believe it or not. In fact, the way to beat a bully is to stand up to a bully, as Mills just demonstrated. And she didn't just beat him, she boasted about beating him. And it was so glorious to watch this because you know she was feeling proud.
A few months ago, I stood in the White House, and when confronted by the President of the United States, I told him I'd see him in court. Well, I did see him in court, and we won. I am so pleased to say that Aaron Fry's able representation of the state of Maine has resulted in a binding agreement by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins and all of her staff, whereby they agree to refrain from freezing, terminating, or otherwise interfering with the state of Maine's access to USDA funds allocated to any official or agency or department of the state of Maine based on alleged violations of Title IX.
Good for her. That is a well-earned victory lap. Now, with that being said, even though this is a major victory for her, it's not entirely over, because even though she got her state's USDA funding restored, she's still fighting against broader education cuts from the Trump administration. The advocate continues, the Trump administration is still pursuing a separate legal attack on Maine, suing the state over its policy and threatening to revoke $250 million in broader education funding through the Department of Education, the New York Times reports. Civil rights advocates warn that the broader case is part of a calculated campaign to undermine protections for transgender athletes nationwide and to use the machinery of government to intimidate states that refuse to fall in line. So even though Trump lost the battle, he hasn't yet lost the war, unfortunately. But I will say that I think it's good that he's choosing Maine to try to make an example out of them, which sounds weird, but it's because I have so much more confidence in Janet Mills than other Democrats who would undoubtedly fold. Like, she's already shown more confidence and courage than so many other Democratic elected officials that I'm glad he's choosing her to pick on, because she's already assured us that she's not going to back down, even knowing what's at stake. Like, she's looking at the prospect of millions and millions of dollars being squeezed from her state's public education system, and she hasn't blinked, not a single time. So the fact that she is the one who he's choosing to take this stand against, that makes me feel a lot more confident. I mean, imagine if this were Gavin Newsome, for example, a spineless clown. He would make some sort of a bullshit utilitarian calculation about how, oh, well, you know, it's just 2 kids, so fuck him. And then he would fold and then boast about how he's a moderate and he's reasonable and he struck a deal with Donald Trump to fund their state's public education system. You can't do shit like that. If you're going to fight, you've got to fight. Stop trying to pretend like you're reasonable. People see through the bullshit. Like, those 2 trans kids deserve somebody to fight for them. They deserve to live with dignity as their cis peers do. And it's not just about those 2 kids, right? If you won't stand up for the most vulnerable constituents in your state, you have no business being in a position of power, period. So I fully expect Janet Mills to see this through to the end, which is good. And even though, you know, I've harped on weaker Democrats, I also want to take some time to highlight better examples of ones who actually do fight Donald Trump. J.B. Pritzker of Illinois, Andy Beshear of Kentucky, and Tim Walz of Minnesota, just to name a few. They're actually fighting this administration, and their refusal to back down to fascists should be the bare minimum expectation of all elected Democrats. But as we've seen, too many Democrats would rather roll over and die than stand up to Republicans, either because they're cowards or because they think that collaborating with fascists will make them look more reasonable to voters, and that's going to bode well for their political ambitions. But one thing that does give me hope is the fact that Democratic Party voters in particular, they do seem to be getting at least a little bit better at sussing out the frauds. Not entirely, but there's some measurable improvements, which is very good. Now, to demonstrate why I think this is the case, I'm going to go back to Alyssa Slotkin's appearance on The Daily Show, because she characterized herself as a fighter, but people in the comment section were not buying it. And I'd be remiss to not point out the way that she purported to be a strong fighter. She did this in the cringiest fucking way imaginable. Just watch.
People are looking for a little alpha energy.
Yeah.
And I think I had like a little bit more alpha energy than the average Dem. Okay. And I want us to get more alpha energy as Democrats.
Okay.
I don't know who sees this and thinks, yeah, that's what I want. I want somebody who's going to be an alpha. It's not that complicated. Okay? Just fight Republicans, give us healthcare, cancel student debt, stop supporting a genocide in Gaza, and tax the rich, and stop using these fucking platitudes. Stop being insufferable. Okay? It's not about your alpha energy. It's about the policies that you're fighting for. I don't care about how you present yourself. You could be the most boring milquetoast person in the world, but if you are committed to getting policies passed that improve our material conditions, I'm on your side. You don't have to have charisma, although that helps. You don't have to be particularly savvy or knowledgeable. You just have to do the right things, and I'm on your side. I think most people would agree with that. And even though, you know, she spoke negatively about the status quo in that same clip, if you watch the full thing, everyone can see that this person is the embodiment of the status quo in Washington, D.C. And basically every single commenter saw through her bullshit. Here's some examples. The only other speech I've seen from her is the one where she talks about her admiration for Reagan. She says Democrats shouldn't just oppose Trump, but also convey what they're for, yet criticizes Bernie and AOC for using the word oligarchy because it takes the focus off of Trump. Again, no policy, just platitudes. Disappointed to see her given airtime on The Daily Show when she epitomizes the problem with the Democratic Party and why Democrats' approval rating is just 27%. She is a reason why people are disappointed since she voted yes on all of Trump's cabinet picks. Her attack on Bernie Sanders and AOC is infuriating. She represents all that is wrong with both parties when politicians cater to big donors at the expense of the people who elected them. And just a correction, she didn't vote for all of them, she voted for 9 of them. Moving on, this person says propping up corporate Democrats who are partially responsible for getting us into this mess is disappointing to see from The Daily Show. Why have Slotkin, Emanuel on if you aren't going to actually hold them accountable? First, bringing Rahm Emanuel without challenging him, and now Slotkin. If you're going to put these monsters on television, maybe actually interview them. No more neoliberal Dems, thanks. My main issue with her, besides almost everything people have been saying, is that she talks about talking about kitchen table issues, but never actually talks about kitchen table issues. These comments give me so much hope. Stay focused. And to that last person's point, the entire comment section was against her. Now, to be fair, I didn't look at literally every single comment, but I did not see one single positive comment. They were all talking about how she was a fraud and they don't believe her, which is encouraging. And I've got to say, the people who mentioned it about The Daily Show's softball interview style, they are spot on. If you're going to bring on people in power or people who want power, you actually have to challenge them. Otherwise, you're no better than the Trump sycophants at the White House press briefings asking the press secretary how she's so good at balancing her job and motherhood. Like, it's hacky, and The Daily Show should know better and be better than that. And that goes for Jon Stewart too, unfortunately. You know, don't think we haven't seen those interviews with Rahm Emanuel, Hakeem Jeffries, and Mark Cuban on his podcast. I mean, anyone who doesn't challenge these corporate Democrats, you are culpable in their shittiness. Because if you're not pressing them to be better, then there's not going to be an incentive to be better if they know that they're never going to be questioned about it. Like, they're not going to come on my show where somebody shit talks them and then asks them tough questions. They're going to go on mainstream television. So if you have the opportunity when they're in front of you to ask them tough and challenging questions, why wouldn't you take that opportunity? I mean, if these politicians are not talking about specific policies and only speak broadly about problems and use platitudes and offering no real material solutions, that is a sign that they're not going to change the status quo. And if the status quo is the problem, we all agree on that, why not challenge them to be better? I don't know. It's just, that's frustrating to me, but that's a bit of an aside. I don't want to be too negative in this video because I wanted to give you all some feel-good news to help us get through the terrible week. But in conclusion, Democrats need to stop talking about what they think people should talk about and do, and just fucking do it. Actually walk the walk like Janet Mills and others. See, talk is cheap, but until you actually put some numbers up on the scoreboard against Donald Trump like Chris Van Hollen did, or Bernie Sanders and AOC, or Janet Mills, you should stop talking and start listening. We don't need to hear from people like Alyssa Slotkin who didn't accomplish shit. We need to hear more from people like Chris Van Hollen, or J.B. Pritzker, or AOC and Bernie, who are actually successful at challenging this administration.
Mom, I'm gay. Gays. Gays. Mom, I'm transgender.